Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you as we continue walking through the book of First Samuel. And today, as we dive into chapters 16 and 17, we're going to get to meet for the first time this man after God's own heart, really kind of the central hero of the book of Samuel, David. And as we dive right in, we're going to start with chapter 16, verse 1, and just continue as we're looking through this to be noticing some of the similarities and the differences between David and Saul. We're going to just continue to see the author of Samuel, perhaps Samuel himself, continue to just set these two contrasts between these two kings that center in this narrative. So 16 verse 1. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." It's interesting as we start to kind of picture this scene. We're going to be seeing Samuel sent to Bethlehem. And to us, this makes sense. Bethlehem is kind of the centerpiece, or at least one of the centerpieces of our Christian faith. I mean, we sing about this little town of Bethlehem every Christmas, right? This is where Jesus was born. This is where the Messiah would come. This is an exciting, incredible, important city in the life of God's people. And yet, to this point in 1 Samuel, Bethlehem hasn't featured very prominently in Israel's narrative. So far, in terms of references to Bethlehem, we've had Genesis chapters 35 and 48, and they both actually reference the same thing. Both of these are the telling and retelling of Rachel, Israel or Jacob's wife, her death and burial. And it's not as if Bethlehem was where she wanted to be buried. Jacob and Rachel are traveling through the land of Canaan, trying to get back to a settlement that they want to be at. And as they do so, Rachel passes away. And so they bury her, and it just happens to be by this little town of Bethlehem. And so this is why this is marked. Genesis 35, and then in 48, Jacob, now known as Israel, retells the story. Rachel died by Bethlehem, and I buried her there. That's Bethlehem's references in the book of Genesis. Then in Judges chapter 17, we hear about an unfaithful Levite who moved away from Bethlehem. And the way that the Levitical priesthood worked, it isn't like our call process where pastors go potentially to many different churches throughout their lives. These Levites were called to serve the area that they were born to. And so this Levite leaving Bethlehem is actually being unfaithful to his calling and perhaps tells us something about the spot where he's at, right? This Levite wants to get out of Bethlehem. He wants bigger and better things. Bethlehem is certainly not featured prominently there. Just kind of an afterthought again. Now, the book of Ruth, which is prior to 1 Samuel in our ordering of the Bible, certainly features the town of Bethlehem. Bethlehem is the setting for this book. But I think it's important to note that the book of Ruth, we think, is written around 1000 BC. And David starts his reign actually earlier than that. David's reign starts in about 1009 BC. And we're pretty sure on the reigns of the kings. If you go back far enough, you might be able to find this in another one of our presentations. Because in 1 Kings, it kind of gives us a listing of how long it had been. Just the time between when Solomon takes his throne and the time that Israel had left Egypt. And we've actually even been able to compare that with some other extra-biblical sources. There's some stuff from the Assyrian Empire that seems to match up with the dates that we have in the Bible, which is always cool when you see archaeology supporting the scriptural narrative. But what I really want to focus on with this is the fact that David's reign starts prior to the book of Ruth being written. So while this is an incredible story, we actually see it only in the scriptures because I think of David's influence. I think as David takes the throne, people are interested in his background. He's from this little town of Bethlehem that no one has ever really heard of. It's a small town, small village. Who is David? Where does he come from? And as they begin to dig into the research, as they begin to go into Ancestry.com and find out a little more about David, they realize that there's this incredible story of faithfulness not that far back. You've got Boaz, who's the father of Obed, who's the father of Jesse, who's the father of David. So I believe, if I'm doing my math correctly, that makes him his great-grandfather. Boaz is David's great-grandfather. And so that is why this story gets included, because it's this great story of faithfulness stemming from the life of this king, of King David, of this faithful king. But when Samuel is coming into town, he hasn't heard this story of Boaz and Ruth and Naomi, this incredible story of faithfulness, of God's provision in the midst of difficulties. He hasn't heard this story. He's getting sent to this backwater, legitimately little town of Bethlehem. It's not exactly where you would think to be going for a king. Verse chapter 2, and Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me." Samuel's saying, look, if Saul hears that I go and anoint someone else to be king, Saul's going to kill me. And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. And invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. And you shall anoint for me him whom I declare to you." So the Lord sends him to Bethlehem, and he sends him to Jesse, again, not some well-known, famous man of the day, a small-town man. Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him, trembling, and said, "Do you come peaceably?" And we see here actually the proper response to this prophet in their midst. The people of Bethlehem know that sometimes when a prophet comes, it's because he comes to bring judgment, to bring God's judgment upon his people. And so they're trembling. They're worried that this might be a message of judgment, a message of wrath. But Samuel tells them, verse 5, he said, "Peaceably, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." So Samuel looks at Eliab, and if we'll recall, did Saul look kingly? Yeah, he did. He was head and shoulders taller than everybody else. And so Samuel looks at Eliab, and Eliab in his appearance must also look kingly. He must be big, strong, handsome. He looks like a king. And so Samuel says, this has got to be the guy. Verse 7, "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." These words from God really remind us of just how countercultural the Christian life, the Christian faith is. The world repeatedly tells us that appearance matters, that we need to be thinner, that we need to be more fit. In fact, I have read before that height in men correlates to pay. So the taller you are, the more you get paid. Not that there's a causation, but there is a correlation between those two things. Now, of course, that has nothing to do with one's ability, but the world places a huge emphasis on what you look like on the outside. But here we see God saying, no, that's not what I'm concerned with. I'm concerned with the heart. And he says the same thing to you and me. He says, I'm not concerned about your outward appearance. I'm concerned with the heart. I'm concerned with whether or not Christ has entered into your heart, whether or not Christ has transformed your heart into be a heart after mine, into being someone who loves as I loves, into being someone who cares as I cares, into being someone who will follow after me wholeheartedly because their heart is after me. Not because of anything special you've done, not because of your outward appearance, but because Christ has entered in and has changed you. Man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. Verse 8, "Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel, and he said, Neither has the Lord chosen this one. Then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, Neither has the Lord chosen this one. And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, The Lord has not chosen these." So 7 sons come parading past Samuel. God has promised Samuel that he's going to find the king, the proper king, here amongst Jesse's sons, and he's not finding him. And so Samuel says, verse 11, Are all your sons here? And he said, There remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, Send and get him, for we will not sit down till he comes here. And I find this fascinating. We're talking already about how this is this little town of Bethlehem. It's kind of a no-name town. And now they're sending for the 8th son, not even the cool biblical number, the 7th son or something like that. No, this is the 8th son. And in fact, he's so low on the family totem pole that when when Samuel invites the family to the sacrifice, they don't even think to get him from the field. They say, he's fine out there. We don't need him here for this. He's caring for the sheep. We're going to let him do that. The rest of our family is sufficient to be here for the sacrifice. Verse 12, pardon. And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And the Lord said, Arise, anoint him, for this is he. I do think it's interesting that God has just said, I don't really care about the outward appearance. I look at the heart. And now we hear this depiction of David. But really, I think this is just kind of for our benefit, just to provide us with a little more detail to this story. This word ruddy in particular, I think, is meant to demonstrate just how young he is. We're not 100% sure what it means. It's also used to describe Esau, who, of course, is very hairy as he comes out from the womb. But this red cheek nature, I think, is supposed to indicate that he can't grow facial hair yet, that he's still baby-faced, that he's ruddy, that his cheeks are red with youth and vigor. Verse 13, Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And Samuel rose and went up to Ramah. I really appreciate this image because we have David here being anointed by the elder statesman Samuel, surrounded by his 7 brothers as well as his father, and he's holding his shepherd's staff. And it's a reminder of this shepherd king who points forward to a greater shepherd king. In fact, we even see the sacrifice over here, a lamb. And so while David will not sacrifice himself for his people, while he will not be able to give that perfect sacrifice, we know that our future king will. That he will be a sacrifice of perfection. A sacrifice that opens the door to an everlasting kingdom. In fact, I actually even think here in the background we see this table with what look like claws underneath it. I think it is supposed to symbolize the bear and the lion that David claims that he has defeated on his own with the Lord's help. Later on in chapter 17, we'll get there. And so, we're supposed to see this shepherd king as a protecting figure, as someone who cares for his people, as someone who cares for his flock, as David will do, and as our shepherd king will do even more perfectly. Also of note here, notice that in verse 13 we see the Spirit of the Lord rushing upon David just as it did upon Saul just a few chapters prior. But notice that Samuel rises up and leaves to Ramah. I think this is interesting because in the life of Saul, we see Samuel almost always present, guiding Saul. David doesn't need that guidance. He's a man after God's own heart. He's going to follow where that Spirit of God that is resting upon him is leading. And whereas Saul was not able to immediately fulfill that promise of the Spirit, in just a few short verses, we're going to see that Spirit at work in David's life, propelling Israel to a great victory, proving his rightful place as king. But before we get there, we're going to read a couple verses that again directly contrast this David with the Spirit of God and Saul without. Verse 14, Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him. And Saul's servant said to him, Behold now, a harmful spirit from God is tormenting you. This isn't meant to be seen as God picks up a harmful spirit from in the ranks of heaven and sends it upon Saul. No, God doesn't do that. God is not the source of evil. But because we believe that God is all-powerful, when evil happens, we know that God could have stopped it. And that can lead us to this interesting frustration, these interesting worries. Well, does God really have my best interest in mind? Is God really caring for all his people? And maybe that's not even the best way that we should be looking at it. Maybe we should be looking at it. Someone pointed this out as we talked about this in G3. A parable of Jesus who talks about when he drives out a demon, if the proper spirit does not enter, if God's spirit is not entering into our lives, then our lives are just open to that demonic influence, into that influence of evil and suffering from Satan. And so, in some respects, perhaps, because in that parable, Jesus talks about, well, that demon will come back with 7 of his friends and say, oh, look, the house is swept clean for us. It's just like we left it. Let's hop on in. And perhaps we see that being reflected here in Saul. Saul has abandoned the Spirit of the Lord, so that Spirit of the Lord has abandoned him. And now we see those evil spirits able to influence him. Regardless, it is certainly a difficult question, a difficult passage that we need to wrestle with. But we do also need to trust that God is in control. And that God is love. And that he cares for us, and that he's going to care for us as his people. Verse 16, let our Lord now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is skillful in playing the lyre. And when the harmful spirit from God is upon you, he will play it, and you will be well. So Saul said to his servants, provide for me a man who can play well, and bring him to me. I think this is interesting. This also seems like Saul has his mind kind of in the wrong place, at least to my interpretation. As we think about Saul, he has this evil spirit afflicting him. Where do we turn when we have evil in our lives? I mean, look at the New Testament. When people are possessed by these evil spirits, who is the one that drives them out? It's Christ. It's God. It's God who speaks into that midst and provides for his people. And so I think it's interesting that Saul is following his servant's advice and looking somewhere else. He's looking for music. Now, don't get me wrong, music is a beautiful thing. Music can do incredible things. Certainly, music can be moving, and there's a reason why we sing and worship. That's a powerful time for God's Spirit to work. And in fact, we're going to see that God still uses this to benefit Saul. But I think it does still reflect just a difference in priorities about where Saul turns for solace, where Saul turns for his comfort. It's to the things of this world rather than to the things of God. Verse 18, one of the young men, one of the servants, answered, behold, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence, and the Lord is with him. Therefore Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, send me David your son who is with the sheep. And Jesse took a donkey laden with bread and a skin of wine and a young goat and sent them by David his son to Saul. I do think it's interesting. These are the first 3 gifts that kind of mark Saul's kingship. Way back, I think in 1 Samuel 13. Nope, even earlier, I apologize. In 1 Samuel chapter 10, when Saul is anointed king, these are the signs that Samuel says Saul is going to be greeted with. A donkey laden with bread, a skin of wine, a young goat. They're somehow meant to mark his kingship. And so perhaps we see again at least some tie-in here of this future king, marking still the present reign of Saul. And David came to Saul and entered his service, and Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. I do think it's interesting. This verse translates Saul as the one who is loving David. But there's not necessarily anything in the Hebrew that leads us to that interpretation. David is the one who comes to Saul. David is the subject at the start of the sentence. David enters service. Then I think it maybe makes the most sense because Saul is never viewed as the subject in the sentence to say David loved him, David loved Saul greatly, and David became his armor bearer. And I think that really fits with what we see in the following passages. There's going to be a lot of conflict between Saul and David. David is the one who always shows love to Saul, not the other way around. And so I think it does make sense both grammatically and in the context to say it is David that loves Saul. And Saul sent to Jesse saying, let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight. This is why I think some interpreters want to take Saul and make him the subject of loved him greatly. But I think there is a difference, perhaps a slight difference, but a difference nevertheless between earning the favor of the king and earning his love. David is a good worker. He provides what the king needs. but I don't think he necessarily has his love, especially as we look at what comes next. Verse 23, and whenever the harmful spirit from God was upon Saul, David took the lyre and played it with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the harmful spirit departed from him. So, the end of chapter 16, we see that David is in Saul's service, and that when he plays the harp, when he plays the lyre, it does soothe Saul. That God is working through this faithful servant to benefit Saul, even though maybe Saul wasn't looking in the right place to begin with. But now we're going to dive into one of the more famous stories of the scriptures. We're going to look at the story of David and the Philistine giant Goliath. And as we do so, again, we're just reminded of how prevalent this story is in our cultural context. I would say that out of all of the stories of Scripture, this is the one that even non-Christians probably know. We talk about it all the time, the David and Goliath narrative, rooting for the underdog, for the scrappy little guy to take down the big mean giant. I have to admit, when I watch sports, I'm not really much of a fan of the underdog. I really want to see greatness, and so I'm typically rooting for the favorite, unless I'm rooting for one of my own teams. So take that for what you will. Probably says something about me to a degree. But in chapter 17, we're actually going to see that David isn't even the underdog, that he knows that he is the favorite, that he is going to win the victory because who he has on his side. So starting chapter 17 then, now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Socoh and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. So we see here then kind of a typical ancient battle. We talked about this a little bit during our last session, but the Israelites are going to be on the northern flank of this valley of Elah, and the Philistines are going to be on the southern flank. And as the hills slope down into the valley, the two armies are going to be standing on those hills, ready to engage in the valley where the footing is a little more sure, where it's a little flatter, where they can really engage in this warfare on equal footing. And this, again, was typical of what ancient battles would look like. This happens repeatedly throughout the Old Testament, actually even into the New Testament. As we talk about the Battle of Armageddon in Revelation, this takes place at Mount Megiddo. Ar is Hebrew for mountain. And so we're picturing this Armageddon, this mountain, Megiddo, and it regularly was a battleground throughout the Old Testament because it was exactly set up this way. There was a valley that had benefit for troops to be moving in and out, so the two armies would stand on either side of the valley and then charge down in, and the battle would begin. But we're going to see that battle isn't necessarily going to take place quite yet, because we're going to meet a champion. Verse 4, and there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. We can see Gath here. It's one of the 5 major cities of the Philistines. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. Now, that gives us a lot of different weights and measurements that aren't very common to us. So we're going to quickly dive in, and it's time for some Goliath math. And you're going to have to trust my work on this. I'm pretty sure I'm right on all of this, but we'll talk about it in just a second. So Goliath is described as being 6 cubits and a span high. 6 cubits, 1 cubit in the ancient world is equivalent to roughly 18 inches. The way they would measure that typically is from the elbow to the tip of the hand, to the tip of the fingers, and that would be about 18 inches. That's a cubit. A span, on the other hand, is from the wrist, from the end of the palm of the hand to the tip of the finger. And for me, that's definitely not 9 inches. I have some baby hands, unfortunately. But 9 inches would be the general rule of thumb for that. So if you take that math together, you've got a man who stands 9 feet, 9 inches tall. He is monstrous, a giant. And his breastplate, his armor that's upon just his chest, not the bronze on his legs, anything else, just his breastplate, weighs 5,000 shekels. 1 shekel is equal to about 0.4 ounces. So then his breastplate weighs around 125 pounds. So he basically has a full-grown adult woman in terms of weight, in terms of the metal upon him. This is a lot of weight that he is carrying. His spear weighs 600 shekels, or I should say the head of his spear, just the iron jagged blade at the end of it, weighs 600 shekels. So the end of his spear alone weighs about 15 pounds. And the way I picture that in my head, and this probably isn't the best way to picture it, I should probably just picture like a 15-pound weight, but I'm picturing a bowling ball. I use about a 14-pound bowling ball when I go bowling. So we're talking about a little 14, 15-pound bowling ball on the end of this spear of iron. This is a menacing individual, a champion, a fighter. Now, as we think about this height, it's not completely out of the ballpark of what we know as the tallest man. I think the tallest man in the Guinness Book of World Records is around 9 feet tall. But of course, as we picture Goliath, he is a great fighter, a champion, someone who has been fighting from his youth. And when we picture kind of giants of today, that's not quite how they operate. My understanding is that in general, they're typically not very coordinated because their body is kind of collapsing upon itself. It's growing so big to the point that athleticism is difficult. But that's not what we're supposed to picture with Goliath. I'm not sure why this has happened, but we see it throughout, actually, the Old Testament. As the people come to the Promised Land, these people are big. They're giants. And so clearly there was a genetic anomaly that has since kind of weeded itself out, been weeded out perhaps, where we had these men who were just massive and warriors and fierce, and perhaps thankfully that has gone down a little bit. But yeah, we're meant to picture this man as impressive and frightening. The reaction of the Israelites is, I think, what most of our reactions would be as they see this giant of a man with his big sword, his big spear, his big shield, his heavy helmet and armor. He's intimidating. And verse 8, he stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And so these words, again, are a direct challenge, and a challenge that I'm sure none of the Israelites wanted to hear. This was a pretty regular practice in the ancient world, where instead of engaging in that awful, bloody warfare where men are just hacking at each other, oftentimes with dull, barbaric instruments of warfare, it's just a scene that we never want to picture. Frankly, a scene that is not very glorified in our films. Typically, when we picture medieval combat with sword and spear, we picture like Aragorn from Lord of the Rings, right? Or Gladiator, or just fluidity and movement, and it's almost beautiful and glorified in some way. It's not what it would have been like. It would have been a press of people, probably people even being trampled and killed in that fashion. Perhaps even confusion as you strike your own army. Just a mess. And so you would send out a champion to fight on your behalf, and the winner of those two champions would win the battle. And that's what Goliath is saying. He's saying, "Send out your champion to me." And all of Israel is cowering in response. And the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. They know that, or they feel like they have no chance in this fight against this great champion from the town of Gath, this giant Philistine. And as we continue, I think Goliath's name is only going to be mentioned one more time. Otherwise, he's just going to be referred to as the Philistine. And I think Pastor Howard talked about this during our sermon series on David in the fall. I think he was spot on. This was good work of the Spirit through Pastor Howard. He was talking about how actually Goliath is just kind of a minor character in this story. The bigger deal is that Israel already has its giant. He's perhaps not 9 feet, 9 inches tall, but Saul is head and shoulders taller than the rest of Israel. He's the king. He's strong. He's big. He's supposed to be the protector. And now this boy king, this shepherd king, is going to be the one who actually serves God's people. And so I think we really are meant to be, again, just juxtaposing these two kings, even more so than we're supposed to be juxtaposing David and Goliath. Yes, there's comparisons there. Yes, we should look at that fight. But the bigger fight here is which king is going to be faithful. And we all know it's going to be David. Verse 12, now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old, Jesse was already old, and advanced in years. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle. And the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab the firstborn, and next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. So this starts to raise a little bit of a question, I think, in some people's minds as they try to discover and think for themselves, how does this fit in with chapter 16? With this part that we just read about, with David being the lyre player, the player of the lyre who would soothe Saul's soul. And actually, in fact, more of that's even going to come up here. But we also saw that David was made Saul's armor bearer. So why isn't David with Saul? And in fact, the author kind of tells us right now David is in kind of a timeshare. He will be serving Saul, and then he'll be back with his father. There's also another alternative, and we'll talk about it in a little bit. We'll get there. But just continue to kind of think about that question. What's happening here? Why is David sometimes with Saul and sometimes not? How does chapter 16 fit into this narrative? Verse 17, and Jesse said to David his son, take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them. So Jesse is a little worried about his sons. He's got 3 sons on the front line with Saul, and so he's sending his youngest son to deliver some food and to basically check up on the brothers, to see how things are going. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle lines, shouting the war cry. So perhaps he's been here during this 40 days. Perhaps actually he's been absent for these 40 days caring for the sheep. But now David is there and he hears this battle cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. So David drops off the items that he has brought for his brothers, and he runs up to the front lines to see what's going on, to listen to the battle, to see what's happening. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. So this is the first time that David hears this challenge. Maybe as he's been coming in and out, he hasn't always been up near the front lines. Perhaps he's simply just missed the time that Goliath comes out, but now he hears it. He hears Goliath trashing the Israelites. He hears Goliath trashing the God of Israel himself. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. And David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way, so shall it be done to the man who kills him. So David hears a rumor as he's up at the front that anyone who kills Goliath will receive the king's daughter, will get great riches, and his father's house will be free in Israel. His father's house will take on a greater role within the life of Israel's people. And David is intrigued by this. We're going to see why in just a second. David wants a piece of the fight. And so he asks for clarification. He asks some other people in the camp, hey, so is this the real deal? And they tell him, yeah, it is. Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, why have you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. So Eliab says, oh, will you knock it off, David? There's probably some sibling frustration here. This could even be going back to the anointing, right? Eliab might be frustrated that he is not the anointed one, that David is, the youngest brother. He's the firstborn. He's supposed to have that right. He's supposed to be the most important in the family. And now David has received that claim to fame. He is the anointed one. And he says to him, look, you're just being wicked. You just want to see the battle. Stop talking like you're going to fight. You're not. Just go care for the sheep like the little shepherd you are. And David said, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. So David says, knock it off, Eliab. I don't want to talk with you about this. I just want to make sure that if this is real, if I'm going to be rewarded for this fight, I want to know what the reward is. Verse 31, when the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. He says, why is everyone afraid? Just stop being afraid. No longer let your hearts be afraid. I'm going to go take care of this Philistine. Notice David never calls him by name. Just this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. So Saul says to David, hold on a minute, bud. You're still just a kid. I can't send you out there to fight Goliath. Goliath has been fighting since before you were born. He's a champion, and you're just kind of a snotty-nosed kid. This isn't your fight. You aren't the one to handle this. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defiled the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. So David just makes this beautiful confession of faith, right? Saul says, look, you're not strong enough, you're not big enough, you're not old enough, this isn't your fight. And David says to him, look, Saul, I've killed bears, I've killed lions, and in fact, I think he's almost even saying they were more difficult. These creatures were just doing what is in them. They were doing what God has created them to do at this point, or at least what they do in a fallen world. They were eating sheep, and I was able to defeat them. I was able to defeat them with my bare hands. This uncircumcised Philistine that's living outside of God's will, who has defied God, who has defied the armies of the living God, he's no problem. He's going to be just like that lion and like that bear. He's got no chance, Saul. Send me. And Saul is so desperate to have anyone fight this giant that he sends him. And he says, okay, you're young. If you lose, we're supposed to be in servitude to the Philistines, but I'm going to send you. You're at least confident. You got guts, kid. Verse 38, then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail, and David strapped his sword over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Perhaps we're even supposed to be picturing here another reference to just how outgunned the Israelites are. We've read earlier in the book of Samuel that Saul and Jonathan are the only Israelites that have access to iron weaponry, to iron armor. That the nations of the Philistines have been kind of keeping that resource away from Israel. That while they've advanced into the Iron Age, really the Israelites are still just in the Bronze Age, and it's a huge disadvantage. And so Saul, this giant of a man, tries to give his armor to this young man, to this young boy, to David, and obviously it doesn't fit. And David tells Saul, look, I can't go, I can't use these. So he put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield-bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. And so the Philistine says, No, you've got no chance, kid. Am I a dog that you're coming at me with sticks? Or is this some kind of joke? Are you some sort of toy that I'm supposed to play with? You've got no chance. I'm going to feed you to the animals. Your God is fake, and I'm going to be victorious. But then David actually one-ups the Philistine. And I really love this image because it has David in the foreground. And so in the image, David is actually bigger than Goliath as he gets ready to sling his stone into his forehead. I also like this because we've got the shield bearer here. He's not featured in many of the imagery surrounding this battle. His goal was actually to protect the combatant from any wayward arrows. So let's say treachery is afoot. The shield bearer is able to stop that arrow from hitting Goliath. He's not there to protect him during the fight. Once the fight starts, that's between the two combatants. But prior to the fight, that shield bearer is there to protect the combatant so that the other army doesn't take him down illegally, so to speak. David said to the Philistine, verse 45, You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. I'm doing this after services, and we were talking about Matthew chapter 6, at least a little bit. It was our gospel reading. And Christ tells his people, don't worry about food, clothing, drink. Isn't that what David is saying right here? I'm not worried about sword, with spear, with javelin. I'm here with the Lord of hosts. That's all I need. I'm seeking first that kingdom of God. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. So Goliath has said to David, David, I'm going to kill you and feed you to the birds and the beasts. And David says, well, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to chop off your head, and I'm going to destroy your army. David raises the stakes. And he says, it's not because I have a sword or a spear, but it's because God is on my side. We're going to win this battle because God wants his glory to be known in all the earth. And this battle is going to be a great opportunity for him to show just how powerful he is. We don't need sword and spears. All I need is this little stone in my sling. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell on his face to the ground. I don't know if this was the killing blow or not. It doesn't really matter. David is going to make sure that he gets the killing blow in. But archaeologists have estimated that slingers could sling stones as fast as 100 miles an hour. I suppose that might not actually be archaeologists. That might just be more scientists today working with the technology, working with acceleration, all of our laws of physics, and are able to just discover this stone could hit Goliath at 100 miles an hour. I really don't want anything flying at my head at 100 miles an hour, especially not a hard rock, and it sinks into his forehead and the Philistine falls on the ground. So David prevails over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. So he's right. He didn't need a sword or a spear to win this battle. But he runs forward and he picks up Goliath's sword. David runs over and stands over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. So this would imply that the sword stroke is actually what kills Goliath. Again, I love this imagery, this small boy standing over this grizzled war veteran, now bearing this massive sword. He is the giant. He is the favorite of this fight. Goliath never even stood a chance because David had the Lord with him. And that was all David needed to assure his victory. I think that's a helpful reminder for us as we go through this life. All the other stuff can fade away. What we need is the Lord. It is the Lord who provides us with strength and honor and victory. And frankly, that victory for us might not even be today. Yes, there's this very physical victory that David wins, but we know that our victory is actually an eternal victory. a victory that Christ has won in his death and resurrection, a victory that he will return to proclaim to us as he raises all the dead to life, believers to eternal life with him in a new heavens and a new earth. We need to seek the kingdom first, and everything else will be added unto us as well. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Sharaim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. So David claims his reward, at least from the fight. He gets Goliath's armor. He takes the head to Jerusalem. And as soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, As your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And the king said, Inquire whose son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from the striking down of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, Whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant, Jesse the Bethlehemite. So as we read these words again, this is where that kind of struggle with chapter 16 comes in. It says that Saul doesn't know who David is. And yet if 16 is right chronologically, then David has been playing the harp for Saul for who knows how long prior to this battle. In fact, David is already Saul's armor bearer. So perhaps it's just out of order, and that could be possible. The author could just be really trying to compare and contrast that spirit of David, a spirit that will lead him to a great victory over Goliath, a victory for God's people, and the lack of the spirit of the Lord in Saul. Instead, we see this evil spirit. Perhaps we could put this somewhere in chapter 18 more feasibly after David has already defeated Goliath. That could maybe help us explain why Abner and Saul don't know him. But I think it actually does take place chronologically, and here's what I think is happening. If we look at Abner, this commander that David is talking to, Abner, we'll find out later, has 10 armor bearers. If the general of the army has 10 armor bearers, how much more armor bearers do we think the king of the army has? Probably quite a few. And it might just be that David was simply a servant. I mean, think about, I don't know any kings. I'll preface that, I suppose. But when I picture kings, I don't typically picture them knowing the names of all of their servants. That's not what I picture. They don't need that. That's not information that is necessary for them to rule. And so I would imagine that most of them don't have that information. Most of them aren't privy to that information. And so what probably happens is that David is serving Saul. And remember, when he's playing the lyre, Saul is raving mad. He's got some spirit afflicting him. He might not even be aware who is playing the harp at this time. But he plays the harp, and then he goes back to his father's house. He goes back to his sheep. So it's possible that Saul didn't recognize him, both because he's just a servant. He just kind of flits in the shadows. He's there when he needs him. Otherwise, he has no real reason to interact with him. And two, second, he doesn't recognize him, perhaps because it's just in that different context, right? Because David is now in the middle of this army, and it's just a different feel, a different vision. Maybe you've had that happen where you know someone, like they look familiar, but you can't put your finger on who they are because you're seeing them somewhere else. I sometimes have troubles with this if I run across someone in the grocery store from church, right? Or if I run into someone playing basketball. They just look totally different. I'm used to seeing people dressed up, and now they're in shorts and a t-shirt. It can be difficult sometimes to catch those people in this different imagery. And so perhaps David is just one of many, right? Just one of many of those servants, someone that Saul maybe kind of recognizes, but not really. Someone who he sees as just a servant. But now that David has won this victory, Saul has to ask and find out who is this guy. Because remember, he's promised his daughter to whoever defeats Goliath. So now this young boy is supposed to become a part of Saul's family through marriage. And so I think that's what we see happening is Saul doesn't recognize David, but now that David has done something truly incredible, Saul has to find out who he is. And so now Saul will always know David because of what David has done, or more accurately, because of what God has done through David. And this is really going to start their relationship, a relationship that we're going to see is quite rocky in the chapters to come. And so thank you again for being with me today. Let's close with a word of prayer. Lord God Almighty, we thank you for this opportunity to be gathered in your word, to hear about this servant David, this man who was after God's heart, who followed your heart. Lord, we pray that you would help us to be servants like David, that you would help us to trust you fully, to stand up against evil and wickedness, both in our lives and without, and to acknowledge your glory, to acknowledge that you have the battle, to acknowledge that you are the one that provides us with blessing and honor and glory, not the other way around. And so, Lord, we pray that like your servant David, we would serve you faithfully all our days and continue to proclaim your name, your glory, your greatness for the world to see. Thanks again for being with me, and next time we'll dive right into 1 Samuel 18, 19, and possibly 20. We'll see how that goes. Thanks. Have a nice day.